Sometimes the most extraordinary heroes walk among us in the most ordinary disguises. They sit on park benches with weathered hands and distant eyes. They stand in soup kitchen lines with stories that could fill libraries. They sleep under bridges, carrying medals they'll never mention and memories that shaped nations. This is what happens when assumptions crumble and true valor reveals itself in the most unexpected moment. What would you do if you discovered that the homeless person you just dismissed had more combat experience than most generals? What if their service record read like a legend? What if everything you thought you knew about heroes was wrong? This is the true story of Admiral Marcus Thompson, a decorated Navy officer who learned that lesson in the most humbling way possible. It's about Sarah Martinez, a woman whose appearance told one story while her service record told another entirely. And it's about a chance encounter that reminded everyone present why we should never judge a book by its cover. The truth has a way of surfacing when we least expect it. Sometimes it takes just one question, asked in jest, to uncover a hero hiding in plain sight. The morning sun cast long shadows across the steps of the Veterans Administration building in downtown San Diego. Admiral Marcus Thompson adjusted his dress whites one final time before stepping out of his official sedan. At 62, he carried himself with the bearing that came from 4 decades of naval service, his chest adorned with ribbons that told the story of a distinguished career. Today was supposed to be routine, a publicity event, a few photos with veterans, some handshakes, and back to his office by noon. The event coordinator, a nervous young lieutenant named Bradley, hurried alongside him with a clipboard clutched to his chest. "Sir, we have about 30 veterans here today, mostly Vietnam and Gulf War era. The media should arrive in 20 minutes. We've arranged for you to speak with a few selected individuals who represent the diverse face of our veteran community." Thompson nodded, his eyes scanning the assembled crowd. Clean uniforms, polished shoes, the expected turnout for a VA photo opportunity. These events were important for morale and public relations, even if they felt rehearsed. He'd done hundreds of them over the years, each one blending into the next. "Admiral Thompson. Over here, sir." A photographer called out, gesturing toward a small group of veterans standing near the building's entrance. Thompson smiled and began making his way over, shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries as he went. It was then that he noticed her. Sitting alone on a bench about 50 feet away was a woman who clearly didn't belong with the organized group. Her clothes were wrinkled and mismatched, a faded army jacket that had seen better days, worn jeans with holes at the knees, and boots that were more duct tape than leather. Her dark hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and she held a cardboard sign that read "Homeless Veteran, Anything Helps, God Bless." Thompson felt a familiar mixture of sympathy and discomfort. Homeless veterans were a persistent problem, one that the VA struggled with daily. But this woman's presence at what was meant to be a positive publicity event was inconvenient. He caught Lieutenant Bradley's eye and nodded in her direction. "Sir, we asked her to move along earlier, but she said she had every right to be here," Bradley whispered. Security didn't want to make a scene with the media coming. The woman seemed to sense their attention. She looked up, meeting Thompson's gaze directly. There was something in her eyes, not the broken desperation he'd come to expect from the homeless veterans he'd encountered, but something sharper. Alert. Almost challenging. The photographers were still setting up, giving Thompson a few minutes before the formal proceedings began. On impulse, he decided to walk over to her. Maybe a few kind words, perhaps information about available services. It would show the media that the Navy cared about all veterans, not just the photogenic ones. "Good morning," he said, approaching her bench with what he hoped was a warm smile. "I'm Admiral Thompson." She looked up at him with those same sharp eyes. "I know who you are." Her voice was clear, confident. Not what he'd expected. Up close, he could see that despite her disheveled appearance, she held herself with a certain posture. Military bearing, perhaps, though it was hard to tell under the layers of worn clothing. "Are you here for the event?" he asked, genuinely curious now. She gestured to her sign. "I'm here every day. This is where I work." Thompson felt the familiar pang of guilt that came with confronting homelessness. Here he was in his crisp uniform, about to pose for photos celebrating veteran success, while this woman sat begging for change. The irony wasn't lost on him. "Have you looked into the services available through the VA?" he asked. "There are programs that might be able to help you get back on your feet." Something flickered across her face, amusement, maybe, or irony. "I've had my dealings with the VA, Admiral. But, thank you for the suggestion." Lieutenant Bradley appeared at Thompson's shoulder, clearly anxious about the delay. "Sir, the media is ready for you." Thompson held up a hand. Something about this woman intrigued him. Maybe it was the way she spoke, or how she seemed completely unfazed by his rank and uniform. Most people, especially homeless individuals, showed some level of deference or nervousness around high-ranking military officers. "What's your name?" he asked. "Sarah Martinez." "Have you served, Sarah?" Now she definitely smiled, though there was something almost sad about it. "Yes, Admiral. I have served." "Which branch?" "Army." Thompson nodded. He'd guessed as much from the jacket, though plenty of civilians wore military surplus clothing. "What was your MOS?" he asked, using the Army term for military occupational specialty. 11 Bravo. Infantry. That surprised him. Women hadn't been officially allowed in infantry roles during most of the recent conflicts, though he knew some had served in combat regardless. "When did you serve?" "Iraq. Afghanistan. Multiple deployments." Lieutenant Bradley was practically vibrating with anxiety now, but Thompson found himself increasingly curious about Sarah Martinez. There was something in her manner, her responses, that didn't match her appearance. "Sir," Bradley whispered urgently, "the cameras are rolling." Thompson was about to excuse himself when an impish thought occurred to him. The media loved human interest stories, and here was a homeless veteran, exactly the kind of person they were supposed to be helping. Maybe this could actually enhance the event's message. "Sarah," he said, loud enough for the nearby microphones to pick up, "would you mind if I asked about your service record?" "For the cameras?" The change in her expression was subtle but unmistakable. The sadness in her smile deepened, but so did something else. Pride, maybe. Or challenge. "You want to know about my service record?" she asked. "If you don't mind sharing. Our viewers would love to hear from someone with your experience." The cameras were definitely rolling now. Thompson could see the red lights on several units, and photographers were snapping away. This was turning into exactly the kind of authentic moment that made for good publicity. Sarah looked at the cameras, then back at Thompson. For a moment, he wondered if he'd made a mistake. Maybe she would be too overwhelmed, or too emotional. Homeless veterans often struggled with PTSD and other issues that made public appearances difficult. Instead, she stood up. The transformation was remarkable. Despite her worn clothing, Sarah Martinez carried herself with unmistakable military bearing. Her shoulders squared, her spine straightened, and, suddenly, she looked less like a homeless person and more like a soldier standing at attention. "My service record," she repeated, her voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "Are you sure you want to know, Admiral?" Something in her tone made Thompson pause. There was a warning there, or maybe an invitation. Either way, he was committed now. The cameras were rolling, the crowd was gathering, and he'd opened this particular door. "Please," he said, though he was beginning to suspect he might regret it. Sarah Martinez looked at the assembled crowd, at the cameras, at the Admiral in his pristine uniform with his chest full of ribbons. When she spoke, her voice was steady and clear. "Staff Sergeant Sarah Martinez, 1st Infantry Division. 3 deployments to Iraq, 2 to Afghanistan. Bronze Star with V device for valor. Purple Heart with oak leaf cluster. Combat Infantry Badge." Thompson's smile began to falter. Those were serious decorations, not the kind typically awarded lightly. The Bronze Star with V device was given for heroic achievement in combat operations. The Purple Heart with oak leaf cluster meant she'd been wounded in action more than once. But Sarah wasn't finished. Army Commendation Medal with 3 oak leaf clusters. Army Achievement Medal with 4 oak leaf clusters. Good Conduct Medal with 5 loops. Iraq Campaign Medal with 4 campaign stars. Afghanistan Campaign Medal with 2 campaign stars. The crowd had grown quiet. Even Lieutenant Bradley had stopped fidgeting. Thompson found himself standing at attention almost unconsciously, recognizing the recitation of a genuinely distinguished service record. Combat Action Badge. Expert Infantry Badge. Airborne Wings. Air Assault Wings. Sarah paused, looking directly at Thompson. And a confirmed kill count of 203 enemy combatants. The silence that followed was deafening. Thompson felt his mouth go dry. 200 confirmed kills was extraordinary for any soldier, unprecedented for someone of Sarah's rank. It was the kind of number that belonged in special operations units, not regular infantry. The kind of number that made someone a legend. 203, he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. Confirmed, Sarah said simply. There were others, but we only count the ones we can verify. The media was in a frenzy now, cameras zooming in, reporters whispering urgently into microphones. This was no longer a routine veterans event. This was a story. Thompson looked at the woman standing before him, homeless, disheveled, holding a cardboard sign, and tried to reconcile what he was seeing with what he was hearing. 200 confirmed kills. Multiple Purple Hearts. 5 deployments to active combat zones. How, he managed to ask, how does someone with your record end up? He gestured helplessly at her sign, her appearance, the bench where she'd been sitting. Sarah's smile returned, but now it was tinged with something that might have been bitterness. That, Admiral, is a very good question. The morning had taken on a surreal quality that Admiral Thompson couldn't have anticipated when he'd climbed out of his official sedan an hour earlier. What was supposed to be a routine photo opportunity had become something else entirely, a moment of reckoning that he sensed would change everyone present. Sarah Martinez remained standing, her military bearing unmistakable despite her worn clothing. The crowd of veterans, media personnel, and VA officials had formed a loose circle around them, everyone straining to hear what would come next. The cameras continued rolling, capturing every word of what was becoming the most authentic veteran story any of them had ever witnessed. Staff Sergeant Martinez, Thompson said, using her rank deliberately, would you be willing to tell us more about your service? She looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing something in her mind. Then, she glanced at the cameras, at the crowd of faces watching her with a mixture of curiosity and growing respect. Most people don't really want to know, Admiral. They want the sanitized version. The hero story without the messy parts. I'd like to know, Thompson said, and he realized he genuinely meant it. All of it. Sarah nodded slowly. I enlisted in 2003, right after September 11th. I was 19 years old and angry at the world. My brother died in the towers, he was a firefighter with Engine 54. I wanted to make someone pay. A murmur went through the crowd. The connection to 9/11 added another layer of gravity to her story. Basic training at Fort Benning, then advanced individual training. They wanted to put me in logistics or communications, that's where they usually put women back then. But I fought for infantry. Fought hard. Eventually, they let me into an infantry unit as an exception, partly because I could shoot better than 90% of the men in my class. Lieutenant Bradley was frantically taking notes, probably already thinking about how this would play in the media. Thompson shot him a warning look. This wasn't about publicity anymore. First deployment was Iraq, 2004. I was a private assigned to a squad in Fallujah during some of the heaviest fighting. That's where I got my first confirmed kills. 3 insurgents who were trying to set up an IED on a route our convoys used daily. She paused, looking past the crowd toward the street where traffic continued its normal flow, oblivious to the extraordinary conversation taking place on the VA building steps. People think confirmed kills is just about pulling a trigger, but it's not. Every kill has to be witnessed, documented, verified. There's paperwork. Investigation. You don't just get credit for shooting into the darkness and hoping you hit something. Each one of those 203 represents a human being whose death I can prove I caused. The weight of that statement settled over the crowd like a physical presence. Thompson had seen combat, but nothing like what Sarah was describing. The Afghanistan conflict he'd participated in from the bridge of a destroyer was war at a distance, clinical and technological. What Sarah was talking about was war up close and personal. The thing about being good at killing, Sarah continued, her voice steady but distant, is that once your commanders figure it out, they keep putting you in positions to do more of it. I became the go-to person for the difficult shots. The dangerous missions. The situations where someone needed to die quietly and efficiently. A reporter raised her hand. Staff Sergeant Martinez, are you saying you were assigned as a sniper? Sarah shook her head. Not officially. Women couldn't be assigned to sniper units back then. But I could shoot, and I could move quietly, and I could make problems disappear. So that's what I did. Thompson found himself leaning forward, completely absorbed. 5 deployments? 3 to Iraq, 2 to Afghanistan. Each time, I volunteered to go back. My kill count kept climbing, and, honestly, I was good at it. Really good. It felt like the only thing I could do that mattered, that honored my brother's memory. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a small, worn leather wallet. From it, she extracted a military ID card, not current, but official-looking. You want verification of my record? Call Fort Benning. Call the Pentagon. My service number is on here, and everything I've told you is in my permanent file. Thompson took the ID, noting the serious expression on the younger woman's face in the photograph. The Sarah Martinez in the picture looked confident, even cocky. The woman standing before him looked like she'd aged decades since it was taken. What happened after you came back? Thompson asked gently. For the first time since she'd started speaking, Sarah's composure cracked slightly. She sat back down on the bench, suddenly, looking exhausted. That's where the story gets complicated, Admiral. See, the army knew what to do with me when there was a war on. I was useful. Valuable. I could solve problems that nobody else could solve. But, when the conflicts started winding down, when they didn't need someone who specialized in making people dead. She trailed off, staring at her hands. The transition back to civilian life is hard for everyone, Thompson offered. Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in it. Hard doesn't begin to cover it. You know what my biggest skill was after 8 years in the army? Killing people. You know how many civilian jobs require that particular talent? 0. The crowd was completely silent now. Even the traffic noise seemed muted. I tried college on the GI Bill. Lasted 2 semesters. Couldn't handle being around all those kids who had no idea what the real world looked like. I tried construction work, but I'd freeze up every time a car backfired or someone dropped something heavy. I tried office work, but sitting in a cubicle all day felt like being in a cage. Lieutenant Bradley cleared his throat nervously. There are programs available through the VA for PTSD counseling and job placement assistance. Sarah's laugh this time was genuinely bitter. Oh, I tried those too, Lieutenant. Spent 3 years in and out of VA counseling. You know what they wanted to talk about? How killing people made me feel. How I could process my guilt and move forward. She stood up again, her eyes flashing with something that might have been anger. But here's the thing nobody wanted to hear: I wasn't guilty. I wasn't traumatized by the killing. I was good at it, and it served a purpose, and I was proud of it. What traumatized me was coming back to a country that needed me to be broken so they could fix me. They wanted me to be a victim so they could be heroes. Thompson felt like he was beginning to understand. So the counseling didn't help. The counseling made it worse. They kept telling me I needed to feel bad about what I'd done. That healthy people don't kill 200 people and sleep soundly afterward. But I did sleep soundly, Admiral. Every single night. Because every person I killed was trying to kill Americans, and I stopped them. A reporter called out, "But surely you must have some regrets?" Sarah turned to face the cameras directly. "My only regret is that I couldn't kill more of them. That there are terrorists and insurgents walking around alive today because I wasn't there to stop them. That my brother died, and I spent 8 years making sure fewer families would have to go through what mine did, and when I came home everyone wanted me to apologize for it." The silence that followed was profound. Thompson realized he was witnessing something extraordinary, not just a homeless veteran's story, but a fundamental challenge to how society viewed warriors and their role. "The jobs I could get didn't pay enough for rent in any decent neighborhood," Sarah continued. "The jobs that paid enough required skills I didn't have or backgrounds they wouldn't accept. When potential employers looked at my record and saw infantry and combat veteran, they either assumed I was crazy or they were afraid of me." "What about family?" Thompson asked. "Friends from your service? Dead or scattered?" "That's what happens in infantry units with high casualty rates. The friends who survived went back to their hometowns, got married, had kids, moved on with their lives. I didn't have a hometown to go back to. New York felt like a foreign country after what I'd seen." She gestured toward the street, toward the city beyond. "So I ended up here. San Diego has good weather, and there's a large military community, so people are generally decent to homeless veterans. I make about $40 a day with this sign, which is more than I made at most of the minimum wage jobs I tried." Thompson looked around at the assembled crowd: reporters, photographers, VA officials, and other veterans. Every face showed some combination of shock, respect, and uncomfortable recognition of a truth they didn't want to acknowledge. "Staff Sergeant Martinez," he said formally, "on behalf of the United States Navy and the Department of Defense, I want to thank you for your service and sacrifice." Sarah smiled for the first time since she'd started talking, but it was a sad smile. "Thank you, Admiral. But I need you to understand something. I didn't sacrifice. I did exactly what I wanted to do. I got to spend 8 years hunting bad guys and protecting Americans. It was the best job I ever had." She picked up her cardboard sign from the bench. "This isn't about sacrifice or service or heroism. This is about what happens when society needs warriors but doesn't want to admit it, and doesn't know what to do with them when the war ends." Thompson felt the weight of her words, the challenge they represented to everything he thought he knew about veterans' issues and military service. "What would help?" he asked. "What could we do differently?" Sarah looked at him thoughtfully. "Stop trying to fix me, Admiral. I'm not broken. I'm exactly what you made me, a highly efficient killer of America's enemies. If you want to help, find me enemies to kill. Otherwise, just let me be what I am without apologizing for it." The morning sun had climbed higher, casting shorter shadows across the VA building steps, but the crowd showed no signs of dispersing. What had begun as a routine publicity event had become something unprecedented: a raw, unfiltered conversation about war, service, and what society owes its warriors. Admiral Thompson found himself in uncharted territory. In 4 decades of military service, he'd given countless speeches about honor, duty, and sacrifice. He'd pinned medals on heroes and delivered eulogies for the fallen. But he'd never encountered someone like Sarah Martinez, a warrior who challenged every assumption about what it meant to serve and what veterans needed. "Staff Sergeant Martinez," he said, choosing his words carefully, "you mentioned that your record is verifiable. Would you be willing to provide more details for our personnel to review?" Sarah reached into her other pocket and pulled out a manila envelope, worn and creased from handling. "I carry copies of everything, Admiral. DD 214, award citations, deployment records, unit commendations. When you live on the street, you learn to keep important papers with you at all times." She handed him the envelope. Thompson opened it carefully, aware that the cameras were capturing every moment. The first document was her DD 214, the official discharge paperwork that every veteran received. The form was dense with military codes and abbreviations, but Thompson could read it fluently. His eyebrows rose as he scanned the entries. 5 Bronze Stars? Staff Sergeant, you told us about one Bronze Star with V device. I told you about the first one, Sarah corrected. The one that mattered most to me. The others came later, for different actions. Thompson continued reading, his expression growing more amazed with each line. Silver Star. Purple Heart with 3 oak leaf clusters, not 2. Army Distinguished Service Cross. A murmur went through the crowd. The Distinguished Service Cross was the Army's second highest decoration for valor, just below the Medal of Honor. You didn't mention the DSC, Thompson said quietly. You didn't ask for my complete record. You asked about my service. The kills mattered more than the medals. Lieutenant Bradley, who had been frantically researching on his phone, looked up with wide eyes. Sir, I found her unit records online. 1st Infantry Division, 1st Battalion, 26th Infantry Regiment. They called them the Blue Spaders. The unit was featured in multiple documentaries about urban combat in Iraq. Sarah nodded. We spent 14 months in Fallujah, Ramadi, and Baghdad during the worst of the fighting. Lost 43 soldiers, 112 wounded. We accounted for over 800 confirmed enemy kills as a unit. And, you personally accounted for 203 of those, Thompson said, still processing the paperwork. 203 confirmed. There were others in situations where confirmation wasn't possible: nighttime operations, long-range shots where we couldn't recover bodies, indirect fire missions where multiple shooters were involved. A reporter called out, Staff Sergeant Martinez, what was the action that earned you the Distinguished Service Cross? Sarah was quiet for a moment, and, for the first time since she'd started talking, Thompson saw something that might have been genuine emotion cross her face. Ramadi, 2006. My squad was providing overwatch for a convoy that got hit by a complex ambush. IEDs, RPGs, small arms fire from multiple directions. The convoy was trapped in a kill zone with no way out. She sat back down on the bench, and Thompson noticed her hands weren't quite steady anymore. I was positioned on a rooftop about 400 meters away with a good view of the entire engagement area. I could see insurgents moving to flanking positions that would have wiped out the entire convoy, 37 Marines. The crowd had pressed closer, hanging on every word. Even the traffic noise seemed to fade into the background. I engaged multiple targets simultaneously, switching between my rifle and a captured enemy machine gun. 17 confirmed kills in 22 minutes. But, the important part wasn't the kills, it was keeping the insurgents pinned down long enough for the convoy to break contact and withdraw. 17 in 22 minutes, Thompson repeated, trying to comprehend the mathematics of that level of combat effectiveness. The citation reads differently, of course. It talks about conspicuous gallantry and complete disregard for personal safety. But, the reality was simpler: I was good at my job, and my job that day was keeping Marines alive by making insurgents dead. Lieutenant Bradley was still working his phone. Sir, I found video footage from that engagement. It's been declassified and is available on military history websites. The rooftop position she's describing is visible in some of the drone footage. Sarah looked surprised. I didn't know there was video. Would you like to see it? Bradley asked, holding up his phone. No, Sarah said quickly. I lived it once. That's enough. Thompson closed the manila envelope and handed it back to her. The weight of what he'd just read was still settling in. This wasn't just a distinguished service record, it was legendary. The kind of combat history that would typically result in book deals, movie rights, and speaking tours. Yet here she sat, homeless and forgotten. Staff Sergeant Martinez, he said formally, I need to ask you something, and I want you to know that this question comes from genuine concern, not judgment. She looked at him warily. Go ahead, Admiral. With a service record like yours, with the connections and reputation you must have built during your time in service, how is it possible that no one has helped you? That you've been allowed to fall through the cracks like this? Sarah's smile was sad but not bitter this time. That's the question everyone asks, and it's the right question. The answer is complicated. She stood up again, addressing not just Thompson but the entire assembled crowd. When I first came back, I did have connections. Fellow veterans, former commanders, people who knew what I'd accomplished. And they tried to help, at first. Job interviews, letters of recommendation, networking events. What happened? A reporter asked. I happened, Sarah said simply. See, everyone wanted to help the broken veteran. The traumatized warrior who needed healing and support. They had programs for that, budgets for that, feel-good stories for that. She gestured to herself. But I wasn't broken. I wasn't traumatized. I was proud of what I'd done, and I didn't want to be fixed. That made people uncomfortable. Thompson was beginning to understand. They wanted you to be a different kind of veteran. Exactly. They wanted me to talk about how killing haunted me, how I struggled with guilt and moral injury. They wanted me to be grateful for their help and humble about my service. But I wasn't any of those things. A VA official in the crowd spoke up. Surely some employers would have valued your leadership experience, your ability to perform under pressure. Sarah laughed, but this time there was genuine amusement in it. You'd think so, wouldn't you? But here's what actually happened. I'd go to job interviews, and they'd see infantry and combat veteran on my resume. Then, they'd ask careful questions about my challenges adjusting to civilian life. They wanted to know about my PTSD, my anger management, my substance abuse issues. And when you told them you didn't have those issues, they didn't believe me. A woman who'd spent 8 years in combat, who'd killed over 200 people, who'd been wounded multiple times in action. There was no way I could be psychologically healthy. So either I was lying, or I was so damaged that I didn't even recognize my own trauma. The silence that followed was uncomfortable. Thompson realized they were confronting a fundamental assumption about war and its effects on those who fought it. The few employers who might have been willing to take a chance on me changed their minds when they learned about my combat record, Sarah continued. 200 confirmed kills isn't just a number, it's a reputation. It makes people nervous. They started wondering if I might snap under stress, if I might be dangerous to have around. A young reporter raised her hand. But surely your fellow veterans understood? Your military network? Some did. But here's the thing about military networks, they work best for officers and senior enlisted personnel. I was a staff sergeant, middle management at best. Most of my peers were dealing with their own transition issues, and the officers I'd served under had moved on to bigger things. Thompson nodded, recognizing the truth in that assessment. Military networking did tend to favor rank and connections. There was something else, too, Sarah said, her voice growing quieter. The nature of what I did in combat, it made some people uncomfortable, even other veterans. When you're in an infantry unit, everyone fights. But most soldiers never get close to the numbers I racked up. It made me different, even from other combat veterans. Different how? Thompson asked. There's a line between being a soldier and being a killer, Admiral. Most soldiers cross it temporarily, in specific situations, and then step back. I lived on the other side of that line for 8 years. That changes you in ways that make other people nervous, even people who've been in combat themselves. Lieutenant Bradley, who had been quiet for several minutes, suddenly looked up from his phone with an expression of shock. Sir, he said to Thompson, I need to speak with you privately for a moment. Thompson was reluctant to interrupt the conversation, but Bradley's expression suggested urgency. Excuse us for just a moment, Staff Sergeant Martinez. Bradley led him a few steps away and lowered his voice to a whisper. Sir, I've been in contact with Personnel Command. They've confirmed her service record, but there's more. Staff Sergeant Martinez was being considered for the Medal of Honor for the Ramadi action. Thompson felt his blood go cold. Considered? What happened? She was medically retired before the award could be processed. The paperwork got lost in the bureaucracy, and, by the time someone tried to follow up, she'd already been discharged and had disappeared. Thompson stared at Bradley, then back at Sarah, who was waiting patiently by the bench. The Medal of Honor. The nation's highest decoration for valor. And it had been lost in paperwork. He walked back to Sarah, his mind reeling. Staff Sergeant Martinez, I need to ask you about something specific. Were you ever told that you were being considered for any additional awards after the Ramadi action? Sarah's expression changed, becoming guarded. Why do you ask? Please. It's important. She was quiet for a long moment. My company commander mentioned something about it before I was medevaced for the last time. Said there might be additional recognition coming. But I never heard anything official. Thompson felt sick. Here was a woman who should have been one of the most celebrated veterans in American history, sitting homeless on a VA building steps because the system had failed her at every level. Staff Sergeant Martinez, he said, his voice carrying across the crowd, I want you to know that there are people working right now to verify something that should have been resolved years ago. But, regardless of any paperwork or awards, I want to make sure you understand something. He stood at attention and saluted her. You are exactly the kind of warrior this nation needs and should be proud of. The fact that you've been failed by the system doesn't diminish your service or your sacrifice. It diminishes us. Sarah looked at him for a long moment, then slowly returned the salute. Thank you, Admiral. That means more than you know. As the crowd began to disperse and the cameras stopped rolling, Thompson knew that this morning had changed something fundamental about how he understood military service and the complex relationship between warriors and the society they defend. And he knew that Sarah Martinez's story was far from over.